Okay, so this next video lecture is still the continuation of our Module 3, Ethics, Fraud, and Internal Control. So we are now in the third topic, which is internal control concepts and techniques. So internal control objectives. Okay, so basically, I get this objectives according to IACPA, SAS, or the American Institute of Certified Public Accountants, a statement on auditing standards. So according to them, the objective of having internal control is to safeguard the asset of the firm. Okay, because we all know that this is the main resources which is being used, okay, to be converted into a product or used in the rendering of the services for the firm to be able to generate revenues. So that's why it's very important to safeguard these assets from being stolen. Okay. Another objective of our internal control is to ensure the accuracy and reliability of the accounting records and the financial information. So of course, since this financial data are being used by the management and other stakeholders for decision making. So that's why it is very important that it should be accurate and reliable. Another objective of internal control is to promote efficiency of the firm's operations. So basically, internal controls, aside from the safeguard that it provides to the assets and the financial records, it will also help the management or the business entity to operate efficiently, because here they might provide guidelines and procedures or policies, okay, which will enable their workers and all the employee in their organization to follow what is right and what are the activities that gives value to the organization. Another objective of our internal control is to measure compliance with management's prescribed policies and procedures. So this is in relation to number 3 earlier, where there are policies and guidelines that is established and should be followed, and internal controls at the same time will determine if indeed these policies are being complied with. Okay, so these are the internal control objectives. So that's why it's very important for an organization to have their own internal control. So they have also here the assumptions which they modify, okay, to the internal control objective. So first is management responsibility. So here, this is the establishment and maintenance of a system of internal control. Basically, this is the responsibility of the management. So they are the ones who will formulate the internal controls, and they will also be the implementers and supervisors, okay, of the conduct, okay, or the compliance of such internal controls, and they are also bound to follow it as well. Okay, but again, the main responsible party for establishing and maintaining the system of internal control is in the hands of the management. Another is reasonable assurance, meaning the cost of achieving the objectives of internal control should not outweigh its benefit. Okay, so meaning if there is cost, of course there is, okay, in establishing and maintaining internal control, but the management should make sure that the benefits that they get out of having this internal control is greater than the cost that they spent for having it. Okay, and of course, methods of data processing. So the techniques of achieving the objectives will vary with different types of technology that they use. Okay, so of course, internal control should also follow what type of technology the entity is utilizing, so that they will be able to establish the appropriate internal controls for it. Okay. what about limitations of our internal control? So here, of course, there is possibility of honest error. So error here is unintentional. Okay, so meaning this is due to the nature of humans that we are prone to errors. We are not perfect. So there is a possibility, but it should be an honest error, meaning it's not intentional. Okay. Another is circumvention via collusion. Here, there is a possibility also that the employees together with the management will circumvent, or they work together to manipulate or to ignore or to even violate this internal control. So they hide it, so that it will not be very obvious that they actually violate the internal control. So this is a limitation because of the personal and financial interest of the person. Okay, so this is the reason that drives them to do such fraud, probably, or other violations. Another is management of override. So of course, since the management has the final say, so they can manipulate whenever they want. Okay, so that's the limitation. And changing conditions, especially in companies with high growth. So of course, we should understand that internal control should be evaluated, and it must be at the same time go with the growth of the entity. So meaning what was initially established may not be effective anymore once the company or the entity starts growing. So they have to add more internal controls to make sure that they will have the control, and to avoid fraud, errors, and other unnecessary errors and losses, okay, for the entity. So that's the limitation of our internal control. Although initially or mainly, these internal controls should be the shield, okay, against any fraud or misappropriation that will take place in the entity. So exposures of weak internal control, or these are the risk, okay, where internal controls may be weak. Meaning, there is established internal controls but it was not followed, it was ignored, it was violated. Okay, so destruction of asset, theft of an asset, corruption of information, disruption of the information system. So if these are present in your organization, so meaning to say your internal control is weak because the internal controls that you have to avoid it is not effective, was not followed. So that's why it existed. Okay, so we have here the illustration for the internal controls shield. So if you could notice, internal control, as mentioned earlier, serves as a shield to protect the assets against fraud, access, misappropriation, and others. Okay, so that's how internal control works in an organization. It serves as a shield to cover or protect our assets and other resources. So we have here the different types of internal control. So basically, we have three types. Okay, so this is preventive, detective, and corrective. So for preventive, meaning this is an internal control that is established so that even before an error, a fraud can be committed, it will be prevented. Okay, so these are controls that are designed to prevent the event or reduce the risk before they occur. So what are the examples of our preventive internal controls? They may be in the form of policies and procedures, training and education, access restriction. So meaning all of this can prevent or reduce the risk of fraud, for example, to occur. Okay, so it will prevent the unnecessary actions, okay, of the employee or the management. The next type of internal control is detective. So these controls are established to detect the anomalies, fraud that is happening during the time, okay, of their occurrence. So these controls are designed to discover event or reduce the risk during or after its occurrence. So what are the examples of our detective internal control? So we have the log reviews and analysis, access review, vulnerability assessment. So meaning to say, in this case, for example, a fraud existed or occurred. So based on the analysis that they do, so they can detect that there was actually fraud that occurred. Okay, that is the purpose of your detective internal control. And the last is corrective control. So this one is to alter, or meaning these controls are designed to address or reduce the risk after the event or occurrence was discovered. Okay, so after it was detected in the detective internal control, corrective internal control will follow. So here, um, what are the example? Firmware updates, corrective changes to access, restoration from backup. So meaning the damage, for example, was already uh, uh, has taken place, and the entity has the policy or guidelines on how to recover it. Okay, these are the example of your corrective internal controls. So those are the different internal controls, okay, or types of internal controls. We have the preventive, detective, and corrective internal controls. Okay, so we will continue with our discussion in the next video lecture.